Hotel Lima Alpha.
Greetings, friends. I'm glad you've joined us. Some say that as the days grow shorter, the veil grows thinner, and it's easier to steal tiny glances into other realms. Perhaps that's true. Who's really to say what's out there waiting to be stumbled upon? The Nameless Village, a mystery of the Mendip Hills. Dead and forsaken, buried neath a ban, nameless and lost to memory of man. I had been walking nearly all day over the Mendip Hills. Many a village and hamlet had I passed in my wanderings, but none so quaint as one half hidden in a rosy haze which I was approaching. It was nestled deep down in a hollow, and the setting sun tinged the little thatched roofs of the cottages, autumnal-tinted foliage, with touches of gold and crimson and purple. A faint scent of sweetbriar seemed to pervade this tiny village. It formed altogether such a pretty old-world picture. Soft moss grew luxuriantly over the little porches. The last roses of the summer bloomed in their tender beauty from cottage walls and covered like a fairy curtain the diamond-paneled window. Giant hollyhocks and prickly holly bushes, smothered already in scarlet berries, stood like enchanted sentinels at the rustic wooden gates. What, however, struck me as curious was the deathly silence which reigned over it all. Not a soul could I see, and not a sound greeted my ears. I felt as if I had walked into some spellbound haunt, or a village buried in the dusty forgotten past of the Middle Ages. Not far from the church stood the old manor house. I walked along the avenue of splendid chestnut trees which led to it, wondering how it was I had come across no mention of this strange out-of-the-way little place on my map. The house, built of gray stone and mantled in ivy, was evidently of very ancient date. Over the stone portico an inscription was carved, but so discolored by the damp as to be impossible to decipher. The door itself, of massive oak and studded with nails, was black with age. My efforts to open it proved unavailing. I was about to retire when I saw an old dame hobbling towards me. She was attired in a worn black velvet gown, and a white frilled muslin hood covered her head. I asked permission to look over the house, and she was apparently dumb, for she vouchsafed me no answer, but silently produced from the reticule a heavy iron key, with which she began to fumble at the lock. It creaked ominously, opening with a harsh, grating sound to admit me. The old lady did not accompany me, but left me to make my investigations of it. The floors were thick with dust, and the furniture, which mainly consisted of oak, was worm-eaten, whilst some fine specimens of tapestry, hanging limply on the walls, were fretted by a relentless colony of moths. In the long oak-paneled dining hall, several family portraits were fitted into the wainscoting, one of which struck me forcibly. It was the picture of a thin-faced, dark-eyed man wearing a ruff, but the expression was so lifelike and peculiar that it repelled and fascinated me at the same time. Opposite hung the portrait of a girl, but the gloom surrounding the face was so deep that I could make out very little of the features. A handsome silver sconce, the candles burned almost to the sockets, and an iron inkhorn were standing on the table. I passed through many rooms, but a sense of oppression weighed me down, and an identifiable musty odor clung to everything. My footsteps resounded mournfully through the deserted corridors, and I glanced back more than once when I fancied I could detect the sound of hushed voices whispering behind me. At last I entered a strange little chamber, more cheerful than the rest. On the deep window seat lay an old manuscript of music and a mandolin, the chords of which were broken. I looked out of the lattice and saw what must once have been my lady's pleasance. Now it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. Just in the middle of the lawn stood a curiously shaped sundial. The heavy perfume of magnolia tree was in full bloom, which climbed the wall outside, filled the chamber, while a breath of air came sighing in and stirred the tarnished hangings of the four-poster. At that moment I happened to glance once more at the sundial, and caught my breath suddenly. A transparent form of a girl was standing before it, gazing with bent head at the desolation around her. But the vision of illusion quickly faded, and I was left contemplating only the dark shadows of the trees cast by the flickering rays of the sun on the neglected garden. After some little difficulty, I managed to find my way out of the rambling old house, and on the looking back, I saw the heavy door slowly pushed from the inside and closed with a clang, while the key grated in the lock and turned with a hollow groan. All sorts of old fancies crowded through my brain as I walked in the direction of the church, which I was determined to see. The lovers, joys, sorrows, and tragedies of bygone days arranged themselves in fantastic groups in my imagination as I passed up the weed-grown pathway. The church door was open, but it was so dark inside that at first I could make nothing out. But as my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, I noticed the air of mystery which enveloped both the mansion and the village was not wanting here. The pews, black with age, were all very high and narrow. The large one at the chancel of the church was higher than the rest, and square in shape. It also boasted pillars richly carved on each corner, and all round hung velvet curtains spangled with silver cobwebs. Over the altar was a kind of alcove, ornamented with a fresco of cherubim adorning a holy grail. Suspended from the groined roof were some tattered flags, whilst long-robed and mail-clad effigies seemed from their shadowed recesses to fix me solemnly with stony sightless eyes. Feeling an unaccountable weariness creeping over me, I seated myself in the great square pew, leaving the door open. Looking up, I noticed the wax tapers on the altar were burning, throwing dim light over the scene. Then my heart stood still, for gliding slowly up the aisle came a strange procession. First, the figure of a girl, covered with a long white veil, and by her side a tall, fair man, then followed by a silent, gorgeous crowd. The bride and bridegroom approached the altar rails and knelt there. 3 monks stood awaiting them, and one, a man with eyes like fierce, gleaming jewels, stretched forth a trembling, bony hand above their heads as if in benediction. Spellbound, I waited, but the vision faded, passing away noiselessly as it had come into the gathering night. As I continued to gaze in the direction of the altar, my eyes fell upon a coffin. It was draped with a purple pall, while a young, fair-haired man knelt, keeping a lonely watch beside it. Then a monk appeared. I saw his face plainly. It was that of the man whose portrait I had seen in the old dining hall. He stole stealthily up to the kneeling figure. My sight was next dazzled by an upward gleam of steel, something sinking in the dark, huddled heap on the floor, something darker still trickling down the steps, and nothing more. It must have been a dream conjured up by the hidden past. That night, when rather late, I reached the Cheddar. I tried in vain to gain some information regarding the curious little hamlet through which I had passed. Neither my own touring map nor any of those scattered about the parlor table could afford me the desired information. Maybe old Sarah can tell you something, suggested my host. So the next morning, being directed to her whereabouts, to old Sarah I accordingly went. She was sitting in the door of her tiny hut, superintending a buxom young lass in her efforts at gardening. She was chatting volubly, and held a long rake in her horny hand, with which she was apparently in the habit of enforcing her remarks at intervals on the rosy-cheeked maiden, thus obviating the trouble of following her about her small domain. She was evidently not disposed to be communicative to me. The only answer she vouchsafed to my earnest inquiries was, "Say, ye have seen the Mist Village, have ye?" Aye. Be thankful ye came out it sound a limb, nae seek to enter it again. 'Tis dead, I tell ye. Sure 'twas a gruesome tale. Now, Nance, shut thy mouth, child, and tend to the lavender yonder. And Nance only managed to elude the pointed exhortation of the rake by a nimble spring over the watering can. I have often since pondered my strange experience that day on the Mendip Hills. Was it but a wraith after all, or Mist Village, as old Sarah called it? I cannot tell, but next year I must search again, for the village which seemed so suddenly and utterly to have vanished from human ken. That's it for tonight, but I'll be back tomorrow with another tale. Until then, good night, whatever you are.